He wasn't just an actor, he was a force of nature. The kind of man who didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. Who didn't chase attention, it followed him. His eyes carried storms, his silence had gravity, and his presence made everything else seem smaller. On the screen, he was the king of cool. Off the screen, he was chaos wrapped in charm. But behind the leather jackets and fast cars was a boy who fought for survival, and a man who craved freedom more than fame. This is the story of Steve McQueen. Born on March 24, 1930, in Beech Grove, Indiana, Terrence Stephen McQueen entered a world that wasn't ready to protect him. His father abandoned the family when Steve was just a baby. His mother, too young and overwhelmed, left him in the care of relatives. By the time he was a teenager, McQueen had already lived in multiple homes, survived abuse, and drifted through juvenile detention centers. But the hardship didn't break him. It made him sharper, tougher, restless. In a school for troubled boys in California, he discovered two things that would change his life: mechanics and discipline. After joining the U.S. Marine Corps at 17, he began to forge the steel that would later define him: rebellious but resilient, wild but calculating. When he left the military, he wasn't sure where he belonged. That's when fate stepped in through acting. He studied at the Actors Studio in New York under Lee Strasberg, the same school that birthed legends like James Dean and Marlon Brando. But McQueen wasn't like them. He didn't spill emotion. He guarded it. He didn't perform to be admired, he existed to be watched. And Hollywood couldn't take its eyes off him. His breakthrough came with the TV series Wanted, Dead or Alive, but it was the 1960s that cemented him as a cinematic icon. In films like The Magnificent Seven, The Great Escape, and Bullitt, Steve McQueen redefined masculinity. He didn't play heroes, he played flawed men with silent courage. He made vulnerability look strong. He made stillness feel dangerous. And when he got behind the wheel, he turned car chases into poetry. In Bullitt, his high-speed pursuit through the streets of San Francisco became legendary, not just for its choreography, but because McQueen insisted on doing much of the driving himself. He didn't trust stunt doubles. He didn't trust systems. He trusted speed. But success didn't silence his demons. Off-screen, McQueen battled addiction, mood swings, and failed marriages. He could be generous and cruel, warm and distant, all in the same breath. He hoarded motorcycles, mistrusted the media, and kept a shotgun under his bed. Yet for all his contradictions, he was painfully human. He wasn't chasing money. He was chasing control of his image, his life, and his fears. And when fame became too suffocating, he walked away from it. By the late 1970s, he had traded red carpets for the desert, living quietly with his third wife, Barbara Minty. But just as the world began to forget his face, fate struck again. In 1979, Steve McQueen was diagnosed with mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer linked to asbestos exposure. Doctors gave him little time, and he sought unapproved treatments in Mexico, desperate for one last shot at life. But the race was over. On November 7, 1980, Steve McQueen died in his sleep following surgery. He was only 50. The world lost its king of cool. But legends don't fade, they transform. Steve McQueen didn't leave behind dozens of awards or Oscar speeches. He left behind a feeling. A presence. A persona that made men want to be him and women want to understand him. He influenced generations, from actors like Brad Pitt to racers like Lewis Hamilton. Every time someone hits the gas, rebels against authority, or stares down a room without saying a word, they're channeling Steve McQueen. In the end, McQueen's greatest performance wasn't in front of the camera. It was his life. Unscripted, uncompromising, unforgettable. And maybe that's what he wanted all along, not to be a star, but to be free. So the next time you see a Mustang roar down an empty highway, or a rebel walk into a room with fire in his eyes and silence on his lips, you'll know. Steve McQueen never really left. And just like McQueen, the next legend we're about to uncover lived with the same fire, fierce, fast, and impossible to ignore. Stay with us. You won't want to miss what comes next. Some men don't just step into history, they carve a path through it, leaving behind dust, echoes, and a legend too big for any screen to hold. He didn't need superpowers or dramatic music. His presence alone could silence a room. He walked slowly, spoke firmly, and stood like he'd faced every storm and lived to tell the tale. The man was more than a movie star, he was a symbol. A giant of cinema, yes, but also a reflection of America's spirit at its toughest, most unbreakable. Behind the image of the towering cowboy, behind the war hero and sheriff, was a man who fought battles both real and personal, quietly, and with unmatched resolve. This is the story of John Wayne, the Duke, an icon forged in grit, fire, and the heart of the American West. Born as Marion Robert Morrison on May 26, 1907, in Winterset, Iowa, he was raised in modest surroundings. His early years were not golden. When his family moved to Southern California, the future legend was just a young boy doing odd jobs, delivering ice, and dreaming quietly of something greater. As a student, he shone in football and earned a scholarship to the University of Southern California. But fate intervened, and injury cut his sports ambitions short. What could have been a dead end instead opened the door to something eternal. Marion Morrison found work at local film studios, first as a prop boy, then as an extra. It was here, amidst the dust and shadows of early Hollywood, that John Wayne was born. He didn't rise quickly. Wayne spent years in B-grade westerns, silent roles, low budgets, little recognition. But he learned. He studied every camera angle, every line, every pause. Then, in 1939, destiny arrived in the form of Stagecoach. Under the direction of John Ford, Wayne burst onto the screen like a force of nature. His performance didn't just grab attention, it grabbed America. Audiences didn't see a man pretending to be a hero, they saw someone who was one. It was the beginning of a legendary partnership with Ford and a filmography that would span more than 170 movies over 5 decades. John Wayne became the face of the Western, but he wasn't confined to a single genre. He played soldiers in the sands of Iwo Jima, Irish boxers in The Quiet Man, oil wildcatters in Hellfighters, and hardened lawmen in True Grit, a role that finally won him the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1969. In every part, he brought authenticity. No theatrics. No fake swagger. Just raw, honest strength. He portrayed courage not as loud defiance, but as steady commitment to do what's right, even when it was hard. And his success wasn't just in box office numbers, it was in how he made audiences feel safe, proud, and seen. Behind the stoic exterior, however, lived a deeply private man. Wayne's personal life wasn't smooth. He was married 3 times, often clashing with the people closest to him. His patriotism and politics made him a controversial figure in Hollywood, and yet he never backed down. He supported the troops during World War II, visited Vietnam, and spoke to veterans with sincerity, even when others chose silence. His loyalty to the idea of America, flawed but full of promise, remained constant. When lung cancer came for him in 1964, it was almost poetic. The man who had smoked through decades of films now faced his most brutal battle. Doctors removed 1 lung and several ribs. Most would have retired. Not John Wayne. He returned to work, even more determined. He joked, he pressed on, he refused pity. Audiences didn't just admire his characters anymore, they were moved by the man. He used his influence to support cancer research, becoming one of the earliest celebrities to bring attention to the disease. His fight was public, painful, but purposeful. And even though cancer struck again, this time in his stomach, Wayne stood tall until the very end. On June 11, 1979, The Duke passed away at the age of 72. The world didn't just mourn an actor. It mourned the end of an era. His achievements weren't just artistic, they were cultural. Over his career, Wayne received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, an Academy Award, and the unwavering love of millions. More importantly, he broke molds. He proved that strength could be noble, that masculinity didn't have to be cruel, and that courage, real courage, was sometimes quiet. His face still graces murals and postage stamps. His voice is echoed in modern westerns, his swagger mimicked in every generation. Whether you agreed with his views or not, there's no denying his influence. John Wayne didn't just star in films, he became part of the American story. He never asked to be remembered. He just showed up, did the work, played the role, and lived his truth. That's why he's eternal. Because heroes fade. But legends, they stay. They live in grainy black and white scenes, in iconic silhouettes against desert sunsets, and in that deep, unforgettable voice that once said, "Courage is being scared to death, and saddling up anyway." So here's to the man who saddled up every time. And just like John Wayne, our next legend didn't need permission to be great. They built their legacy, one battle at a time. Stay with us, because the next story is about to ride in. Some legends never shout, they simply walk into history with a quiet grace that shakes the world. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He didn't need to be. With a simple glance, a gentle nod, or a pause between words, he made you listen. He carried himself like the wind, silent, steady, and unstoppable. Hollywood tried to define him. Fans tried to label him. But the truth was, he was unlike anyone else. Behind the cool demeanor and the cowboy hat was a man named Gary Cooper, a symbol of integrity, strength, and timeless masculinity. Born as Frank James Cooper on May 7, 1901, in Helena, Montana, Gary grew up surrounded by wide-open landscapes and rugged independence. His parents were British immigrants, and they instilled in him a quiet discipline. At just 5 years old, he was already horseback riding and helping on his family's ranch. This early exposure to the American frontier would later define the roles he would become famous for. But Cooper's path wasn't always heroic. As a young man, he suffered a serious car accident that left him with a permanent limp. The physical pain never fully left him, but neither did his spirit. Gary enrolled at Grinnell College in Iowa and dreamed of becoming a political cartoonist. But destiny had other plans. When his family moved to Los Angeles in the 1920s, Cooper found work as a film extra. It was supposed to be temporary, but the camera loved him. His silent strength, his tall frame, and his natural grace caught the attention of directors. And soon, Cooper went from background cowboy to leading man. His breakthrough came with the 1929 film, The Virginian, where he delivered one of the first iconic lines of sound cinema, "If you wanna call me that, smile." Audiences were mesmerized. Here was a man who didn't overact, didn't boast, he just was. His style redefined acting, subtle, honest, and deeply human. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Cooper became one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. He played heroes not because they were flawless, but because they were real. In Sergeant York, 1941, he portrayed a humble pacifist-turned-war hero and won his first Academy Award. Then came High Noon, 1952, a film that would become a metaphor for courage. As Sheriff Will Kane, Cooper stood alone, facing danger when everyone else turned away. The performance was raw and personal, so much so that he won his second Oscar, even while battling health issues behind the scenes. But Gary Cooper's career wasn't just about awards or box office numbers. It was about what he represented. In a world that often celebrated flash over substance, Cooper stood as a pillar of quiet strength. He was a private man, deeply introspective, loyal to his friends, and respectful to his fans. He avoided scandals, politics, and media circus. Yet, behind the stoic image, there were struggles. Cooper battled ulcers, hip problems, and later, a long fight with cancer. He also dealt with personal turmoil, navigating complex relationships, fame's constant pressure, and the fear of being misunderstood in a changing Hollywood. Yet, even in illness, he never lost his grace. When he learned he had terminal cancer in 1960, he chose not to let the public know. He continued to work, to smile, to live with dignity. His final years were marked by a quiet farewell. In 1961, his close friend James Stewart accepted an honorary Oscar on his behalf and publicly revealed that Cooper was seriously ill. Just weeks later, on May 13, 1961, Gary Cooper passed away. He was 60 years old. But even in death, he remained an icon. Gary Cooper's influence stretched far beyond the screen. He inspired generations of actors, from Clint Eastwood to Kevin Costner, who borrowed from his stillness, his humility, his raw authenticity. He wasn't just an actor, he was an archetype. The tall, silent hero. The man who did the right thing, not because it was easy, but because it was right. His legacy lives in every Western, every film that values character over chaos, every story about courage in silence. He proved that true greatness doesn't need to scream. Sometimes, it just needs to show up, stand tall, and speak with the soul. A man's got to do what a man's got to do. That wasn't just a line, it was his life. And as we close the chapter on Gary Cooper, we invite you to stay with us, because the next story belongs to another legend who, like Cooper, redefined what it meant to be unforgettable. Some men are carved from stone, not just in body, but in will. He was born into nothing, raised in hardship, and told countless times that he didn't belong. But he refused to listen. He didn't come to Hollywood to blend in, he came to conquer. Before the world knew him as a cinematic titan, he was just a poor immigrant's son, angry, hungry, and burning with ambition. This is the extraordinary journey of the man who became a legend, Kirk Douglas. Born Isser Danielovich on December 9, 1916, in Amsterdam, New York, he was the only son among 7 children in a family of Russian Jewish immigrants. Life in their small, impoverished home was anything but easy. His father, a ragman who collected and sold discarded items, struggled to provide for them. Young Isser grew up witnessing hardship firsthand, often going hungry, wearing worn-out clothes, and working odd jobs just to scrape by. But adversity gave birth to determination. Douglas was a fighter, literally. He took up wrestling in high school to toughen up and earn some money. He dreamed of becoming an actor, even as the world around him laughed at the idea. But he didn't care. He applied to St. Lawrence University, talked his way in, and supported himself with wrestling scholarships and dishwashing gigs. Later, he attended the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, where he met a fellow student named Betty Joan Persky, who would go on to become Lauren Bacall. She never forgot him. In fact, years later, it was Bacall who helped launch his Hollywood career. World War II interrupted his path. Douglas joined the U.S. Navy in 1941, serving as a communications officer in anti-submarine warfare. But after the war, he returned home more determined than ever. He got his first big break in 1946, with the film The Strange Love of Martha Ivers. From there, everything changed. In a span of just a few years, Kirk Douglas became a dominant force in Hollywood, his cleft chin, piercing eyes, and raw intensity making him impossible to ignore. Films like Champion, 1949, Young Man with a Horn, 1950, and Ace in the Hole, 1951, established him as an actor who could bring fire and complexity to the screen. In Champion, his portrayal of a ruthless boxer earned him his first Academy Award nomination and solidified his image as a tough guy with a tortured soul. But Douglas wasn't content with just acting. He wanted power. He wanted control. In 1955, he founded his own production company, Brinna Productions, at a time when very few actors dared to take that leap. This move would not only shape his career but change Hollywood itself. Through Brinna, he produced Paths of Glory, 1957, directed by a young Stanley Kubrick, and Spartacus, 1960, his most iconic role. Spartacus wasn't just a film. It was a revolution. At the height of the Cold War, when screenwriter Dalton Trumbo was blacklisted as part of the Hollywood blacklist, Douglas made a bold move. He gave Trumbo full screen credit. That decision, controversial and risky, played a crucial role in breaking the blacklist. It was more than a career milestone. It was a moral stand, one that defined Douglas as a man of principle and courage. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Douglas continued to deliver powerful performances, whether in Lonely or the Brave, 7 Days in May, or The Vikings. He never stopped pushing himself, never settled into typecasting. His characters were often conflicted, fiery, and stubborn, much like the man himself. But his life wasn't without pain. In 1996, a helicopter crash nearly killed him. He survived, but suffered a stroke that left him with slurred speech. Many thought he'd retreat from the public eye. Instead, Douglas fought back, learning to speak again, writing memoirs, and appearing publicly with dignity and pride. His resilience became yet another chapter in his remarkable journey. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1981, and an Honorary Academy Award in 1996 for 50 years of exceptional contributions to the motion picture industry. Beyond the accolades, Douglas was also a passionate philanthropist, donating millions to schools, hospitals, and programs for the underprivileged. Kirk Douglas passed away on February 5, 2020, just days before his 104th birthday. But what a life he lived, one of grit, purpose, and unrelenting will. From poverty to immortality, his story is the ultimate American epic. Kirk Douglas didn't just survive Hollywood. He conquered it, on his own terms. He once said, "You haven't learned how to live until you've learned how to give." That philosophy shaped his career, his values, and his legacy. He came from the dust, rose like a storm, and stood unshakable, forever etched in the history of film. And as we turn the page on his unforgettable life, stay with us, because up next is the powerful journey of another silver screen legend, whose story is just as haunting, inspiring, and extraordinary. Sometimes, the loudest laughter hides the deepest ache, and the brightest smile belongs to the one who's carried the heaviest burdens. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't scandalous. He didn't need to be. His talent didn't scream, it spoke softly, sincerely, and with soul. He slipped into hearts not with headlines, but with heartbeats. For decades, audiences laughed with him, cried with him, and somewhere in between, discovered a piece of themselves. But few knew the weight he carried behind those twinkling eyes. This is the story of Jack Lemmon, the man who redefined the ordinary and turned vulnerability into victory. Jack Lemmon was born on February 8, 1925, in Newton, Massachusetts. Raised by a father who worked as the president of a donut company, Lemmon's early years were filled with expectation and traditional values. But Jack wasn't interested in business. He was drawn to the stage, to storytelling, to the electric possibility of making people feel. Yet his path was never smooth. He was often ill as a child, and his delicate health made him feel like an outsider, too fragile for sports, too thoughtful for the crowd. Still, he found his power in performance. At Harvard University, he joined the drama club and discovered a sense of belonging he had never felt before. After graduating, he served briefly in the Navy during World War II. It was there, between duty and dreams, that he realized life was too short not to chase what he loved. He began acting on radio, then on live television, cutting his teeth in an era where mistakes happened live and nothing could be edited. He learned fast. He had to. The industry was ruthless, but Jack was resilient. His breakthrough came in 1954 with It Should Happen to You, but it was Mr. Roberts in 1955 that turned heads. Lemmon won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, and suddenly, a new kind of star was born. Not macho, not mysterious, but relatable. He was the everyman with a beating heart. But Lemmon refused to be boxed in. While many actors clung to their type, Jack leaped from genre to genre: comedy, drama, tragedy, farce. With director Billy Wilder and actor Walter Matthau, he formed one of Hollywood's most beloved trios. Films like The Apartment and Some Like It Hot cemented his legacy in comedy. Yet, it was in the more serious roles, Days of Wine and Roses, Save the Tiger, Glengarry Glen Ross, that his raw power emerged. In Days of Wine and Roses, he portrayed a man battling alcoholism, mirroring struggles he himself had quietly faced. Jack Lemmon had his demons, personal battles with insecurity and drinking, moments of doubt, of emotional fatigue. But instead of hiding them, he used them. He channeled them into performances so authentic, they cut through the screen. His life goals were simple yet profound: to be true, to be excellent, and to make people feel less alone. He didn't care for fame, he cared for connection. That's why his roles lingered. He didn't act like a character, he became him. Whether it was a lovelorn office worker, a desperate salesman, or a tormented alcoholic, Jack brought grace and honesty to every frame. Over his career, he won 2 Academy Awards, was nominated 8 times, and received numerous honors including the Cecil B. DeMille Award and Kennedy Center honors. But more than trophies, it was the respect of his peers that defined him. He wasn't just admired, he was loved. Actors like Kevin Spacey, Tom Hanks, and George Clooney have cited him as a major influence, not just in craft, but in character. Off-screen, he was generous, humble, and deeply devoted to his family. His marriage to Felicia Farr lasted over 38 years. He was also a dedicated father to Chris Lemmon, who later wrote a memoir honoring his dad. Jack never lost his warmth, never lost his passion, even as the golden age of Hollywood faded. In 2001, after a battle with cancer, Jack Lemmon passed away at the age of 76. He was buried next to his friend and co-star Walter Matthau. His tombstone reads simply, "Jack Lemmon in." As if the final scene was just beginning. But legends like Jack Lemmon don't need grand finales. His legacy plays on, in laughter, in tears, in every moment an audience feels seen through a performance. He made vulnerability heroic, and in doing so, changed cinema forever. So the next time life feels too heavy or too absurd, think of Jack. Think of the man who showed us it's okay to fall apart, and beautiful to laugh through it. And if you think his story was unforgettable, just wait. Because up next, we're diving into the life of another legend, one whose journey was just as heartfelt and extraordinary. Stay with us. He didn't have the face of a star. He didn't follow the rules. But somehow, he rewrote them. In a town that worshipped beauty, he made imperfection iconic. In an industry built on fantasy, he gave us the truth, raw, wrinkled, sarcastic, and deeply human. He was the man with the slouch, the scowl, and the smirk, who made the whole world laugh and feel. Behind that famously rumpled face was a heart that had survived war, poverty, and pain. And somehow, still found joy in every broken moment. This is the story of Walter Matthau, the man who became a legend by simply being himself. Walter John Matthau was born on October 1, 1920, in the tough, immigrant-filled streets of New York's Lower East Side. His father, an impoverished Jewish peddler from Ukraine, and his Lithuanian mother, a garment worker, struggled to make ends meet. Growing up in a cold-water flat with little money, Walter saw hardship early. He worked odd jobs as a kid, selling soda, playing cards for cash, and learned that if you didn't hustle, you didn't eat. But there was one thing young Walter could always count on: his wit. Even as a child, he could make people laugh. It wasn't just a gift, it was a weapon. In classrooms, in crowded streets, in soup lines, humor was how he survived. Then came World War II. Matthau enlisted in the Army Air Forces, serving as a radio gunner on bombing missions over Europe. He faced death dozens of times, losing friends in mid-air combat. The experience left scars, but it also gave him something else: perspective. After what he saw in the skies of Germany, he knew that every laugh was precious. Every moment, fleeting. After the war, he returned home and used his GI Bill to study acting. He trained at the New School for Social Research, throwing himself into Shakespeare, Chekhov, and anything that challenged him. But Walter didn't fit the leading man mold. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, and his style was rougher, more grounded. He struggled to get roles, often being overlooked or typecast as the grumpy sidekick. But he kept going. Not because of fame. Not for money. But because performing was the only thing that made sense to him. His goal wasn't to be a star, it was to be honest. And that honesty would become his secret weapon. In the 1950s, he found steady work on Broadway, honing his comedic timing in plays like Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter? And A Shot in the Dark. Slowly, Hollywood began to take notice. But the moment that changed everything came in 1966, when Matthau starred in Billy Wilder's The Fortune Cookie, opposite Jack Lemmon. Their chemistry was instant, electric. Matthau played the scheming, lovable shyster Willie Gingrich, a role that earned him an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Audiences fell in love, not with a polished matinee idol, but with the crumpled, sarcastic guy who looked like he'd just lost a fight and somehow still won. Walter was real, relatable, and incredibly funny. Then came the defining role of his career, Oscar Madison in The Odd Couple, 1968. Sloppy, grouchy, foul-mouthed, but oddly lovable, Matthau's Oscar became an instant classic. Paired again with Jack Lemmon as the fussy Felix Unger, their on-screen dynamic redefined comedy duos. The Matthau-Lemmon pairing would go on to span over 10 films, including The Front Page, Buddy Buddy, and the iconic Grumpy Old Men series decades later. But Walter Matthau wasn't just a funny man, he was an actor with astonishing depth. In Koch, 1971, he played an elderly man forced into early retirement, delivering a performance so touching that it earned him an Oscar nomination for Best Actor. He balanced comedy and drama like no one else, slipping between roles that made you laugh and those that made you weep, with the same natural ease. Off-screen, Walter was complex. He battled serious health problems throughout his life, multiple heart attacks, bypass surgeries, and the damage of years of smoking. But he never slowed down. Not because he didn't feel the pain, but because he believed that purpose was the cure. For Matthau, performing wasn't just his passion, it was his lifeline. His life goal wasn't wealth or recognition. It was to make people laugh. To give audiences a break from their pain, the way humor had once saved him. And in that, he was incredibly successful. He married Carol Grace, an actress and writer who had once inspired Truman Capote's Holly Golightly. Their marriage lasted over 40 years, a rare achievement in Hollywood. Together, they raised a family, and his son, Charlie Matthau, would go on to become a director, continuing the creative legacy. By the late 90s, Matthau was older, slower, but never out of touch. Films like Out to Sea and The Odd Couple 2 proved that age only sharpened his talent. He kept making movies until the very end, until his body simply couldn't anymore. On July 1, 2000, Walter Matthau passed away from a heart attack at the age of 79. His longtime friend and on-screen partner Jack Lemmon died just 1 year later. Hollywood lost not just a star, but a soul. A man who defied beauty standards, rewrote comedy, and proved that authenticity is the greatest talent of all. Today, Walter Matthau's films remain timeless. His delivery, his timing, his humanity. He didn't chase success, he attracted it by being unforgettably real. He wasn't the dream. He was the wake-up call. And that's why we still remember him, not for how he looked, but for how he made us feel. But Walter Matthau wasn't the only one who rose through struggle and left an eternal mark. Stay with us, because in just a moment, we'll open the curtain on another remarkable life, one that will move you just as deeply. He spoke softly, but when he did, the whole world listened. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He never chased the spotlight. And yet, his presence on screen was impossible to ignore. He carried a quiet storm within him, one that mirrored the struggles of a nation, the weight of integrity, and the ache of a man constantly searching for truth. Behind those piercing blue eyes was an artist, a patriot, a father, and a fighter, whose journey to greatness was never easy, but always honest. This is the story of Henry Fonda, an American icon who didn't just play heroes, he defined them. Born on May 16, 1905, in Grand Island, Nebraska, Henry James Fonda was the son of a printer and a homemaker. His childhood was shaped by Midwestern values, discipline, humility, and a deep sense of moral responsibility. But Henry wasn't a dreamer in his youth. In fact, acting wasn't even in the picture. He studied journalism, worked as a mechanic, and even considered becoming a civil engineer. Fate, however, had other plans. In his early 20s, a chance invitation to help out backstage at a local community theater changed everything. Henry stepped onto the stage and found his calling. What started as a hobby quickly turned into a passion. He moved to Minnesota and joined the University Players, where he crossed paths with a young actress named Margaret Sullivan, his first wife and one of his lifelong influences. Together, they went to New York City, where the real struggle began. The early years were brutal. Fonda lived in cheap apartments, taking any job he could, usher, stagehand, waiter, just to survive. But he never gave up. He trained hard, studied his craft, and slowly, the doors began to open. He debuted on Broadway in the early 1930s, and soon after, Hollywood came calling. His first major breakthrough came in 1939 with Young Mr. Lincoln, directed by John Ford, followed by his unforgettable portrayal of Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath, 1940. That role earned him his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, and more importantly, it established him as the voice of the common man. Fonda had a unique gift. He didn't act for the camera, he acted through it. With quiet strength and emotional truth, he became the conscience of American cinema. But just as fame found him, World War II changed everything. Fonda put his career on hold, enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and served honorably for 3 years, earning a Bronze Star for valor. That decision reflected who he truly was, a man who didn't just play heroes, but lived by their values. After the war, Fonda returned to acting, but he didn't chase commercial hits. His goal was never fame, it was substance. He chose roles that meant something. Films like My Darling Clementine, 1946, 12 Angry Men, 1957, and Fail Safe, 1964, weren't just performances, they were statements. 12 Angry Men, in particular, was a personal project. Fonda produced the film himself after no studio would back it. Playing juror number 8, he stood for justice, reason, and compassion in a room full of prejudice and anger. The film, though modest in its initial success, would go on to become one of the most celebrated American films of all time. Despite his success, Fonda's personal life was often turbulent. He was married 5 times, and his relationship with his children, Jane and Peter Fonda, was complicated. They saw him as distant, emotionally reserved, a man more comfortable on set than at home. But even in that struggle, there was honesty. He was never perfect, never pretended to be. That complexity made him real. In the 1960s and 70s, as Hollywood changed, so did Fonda's career. He took fewer roles, but when he did appear, he left an impact. He played against type in Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968, portraying a cold-blooded villain, shocking audiences and proving his astonishing range. And then, in the twilight of his life, he gave one final, unforgettable performance. In 1981, alongside his daughter Jane, Henry starred in On Golden Pond. The film mirrored their real-life estrangement, and through the lens of fiction, they found reconciliation. Fonda's portrayal of an aging father struggling to connect earned him his long-overdue Academy Award for Best Actor, at the age of 76. Just months later, on August 12, 1982, Henry Fonda passed away, leaving behind a legacy built not on glamour, but on grace. He didn't demand attention, he commanded respect. He didn't chase the moment, he defined the era. Throughout his career, Fonda appeared in over 100 films and TV projects, earned 2 Oscars, and countless honors including the AFI Life Achievement Award, the Golden Globe, and a BAFTA. But more than the accolades, his true success was in how deeply he touched people. He gave voice to the voiceless, hope to the hopeless, and dignity to roles that others might overlook. He wasn't a star because he wanted to be, he was a star because the world needed someone like him. Henry Fonda didn't play heroes, he reminded us of the hero we all could be. And even now, his legacy continues, not just in film, but in the values he lived by: truth, humility, and quiet courage. But Henry wasn't the only icon who walked quietly and left footprints that will never fade. Stay with us, because up next, we uncover the powerful journey of another Hollywood giant, one whose story you don't want to miss.